excited to have you all tune in to share in the Vermont Benefits Survey results. I'm Barry Blixt. I work as an account lead at Hickok Boardman Benefits Consultant. And typically Michael Kilfoyle is the one presenting on this data each year. And I have the pleasure of taking lead this year. But luckily, Michael will be wingmanning for me on a couple of slides here today. And, this is actually a survey that he had come up with years ago because he realized all the data that we had wasn't for Vermont. It was all national data. And when we were advising our clients, we found it was a little bit of a challenge because it wasn't apple to apple. We've got a really unique and small market here in Vermont. And we wanted to start collecting that data on our own. I'm sure most of you know Michael, but I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michael. Good to see all of you.
That's Michael. Yeah, excellent. Well, we'll start with what we're going to talk about today. We're going to give you a little update on the market, just a general update on both national and Vermont trends that have been going on during 2020, during COVID, and that sort of thing. We'll also talk a lot about survey results. That's the bulk of this presentation, and we'll give some commentary on that. And then we'll open it up to talk a little bit about what's next for employers. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, and I'm actually going to ask that if you guys have questions during the presentation, feel free to speak up, or you can utilize the chat. And Michael, if you don't mind, if you could keep an eye on the chat. It's kind of hard with the presentation view, but we'll stop periodically and see if anyone's got questions, and we can certainly address those as we move forward. All right, let's talk about 2020. This was a really interesting year for a lot of reasons. We had a lot of different things going on, and it's probably a year that a lot of us want to forget. But just to recap a few things that happened. I know Stacy just mentioned Colorado was on fire, but also the West Coast was, Australia. The Olympics were canceled in Tokyo. Our government confirmed, we actually found and have recovered UFOs. Prince Harry quit the royal family. I've got a crown down there showing that. We learned that there was such thing as murder hornets, and they somehow found their way in the United States. But, the biggest thing that happened that impacted business and our economy was COVID-19, right? And, unfortunately, it's caused a lot of us to have to rethink the way we operate and run our businesses. And, this year kind of started out tough to begin with. We had some tough renewals last year. And it wasn't too far in that we had to, lock down, and essentially it led to layoffs, furloughs. Many of us had to develop business continuity plans that we wouldn't necessarily have had in place, or dust off old ones that needed to be reworked. We had to define if we were essential or non-essential. A lot of things happened. And, I think I'm kind of exhausted by the term of pivot, but we pivoted a lot in this year. And I think we all have COVID fatigue, and I don't want to make this presentation all about COVID, but I do think it's important to highlight a lot of these things that have happened because it's forced us to adapt, right? And I think as we talk about what's happening nationally and here in Vermont, it's important to just note that we've all kind of gone through these things. I think the biggest thing for me as, an employee at Hickok and Boardman, and I'm sure many of you can relate, it's the connectivity to people, right? The connection that we used to have in the office. And I definitely miss that aspect of things. And I can't tell you how bizarre it is to be talking at my computer and not see people. I can see 3 people on my screen, and 2 of them are colleagues, and then a lot of blank screens, but I feel like I'm talking to myself. And it's just a different feel, and we're all trying to adapt and get used to this new environment. But I think we're all here, right? And we've persevered at least to now. And I think the worst is behind us. And I try to remain as optimistic as possible because we as people have this innate ability to adapt. And I think that's a positive here. We're going to step into a healthcare market update, and I'll talk a bit about what's going on in Vermont. But before I do that, I'm going to hand it off to Michael just for a couple of slides that he usually kicks off with in previous years because he tracks the data going back to when the survey started, and I think it tees up the rest of the presentation pretty nicely.
So unlike Barry, I like to hear myself talk, so I'm going to go for a couple of minutes here. So many of you have probably seen this screen that I've shared previously, and essentially it's a snapshot of where we've been and kind of where we're going in some respects. So I'll just draw your attention to the bottom two lines, so sort of that lime green and that teal line. So that those lines are workers' earnings and overall inflation. And what you can see in those lines is, generally speaking, they've held pretty steady over the years. And this chart goes back to 1988. And those are generally tied together and somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4%, depending on the year. And you can see there in 2009, we had the dip that was after the Great Recession. But overall, those have been pretty steady lines. If we go to the blue line there, the one that goes all the way back to 88, what you're going to see there are national health insurance premiums. And again, they've been all over the place. And you're going to see that big dip in the early 90s there. And as many of you probably remember, two things were happening at that point. HMOs had hit the scene, and also Hillary Clinton was trying to get through nationalized health care. And amazingly, the insurance carriers were actually able to lower their rates at the time. So a lot of this is not only driven by market forces when it comes to healthcare, but it's also political forces as well. And then you're going to see there that, as Barry mentioned, we started the survey back in 2001. That's the red line that you're going to see there. So those are health insurance premiums here in Vermont on average across all the people who have participated in the survey. And what this is telling us is that for a number of years, we were basically tracking along national lines, some spikes, some dips. But as you can see, in about 2011, we started going off course there, where national health insurance premiums were getting closer, not quite to the level of general inflation, but closer. While in Vermont, we remained steady at about 7% in terms of our increases. And you're going to see there, we've done this all the way through 2020, and what I call this is the gap. And what we have to remember is that every time there's a percentage increase, that percentage increase is of a larger dollar amount. So while we've been kind of at 7% across the board for the last few years or so, that 7% is of a larger number, which of course means that employers and employees, because of their contributions, are paying more for their health care. So obviously this is not a good situation. This is probably not news to anyone, but I think it's just a good graphic to sort of get us set on where things are and what we can expect going forward, because as Barry mentioned, it kind of does tee things up where employers are doing things differently now because they need to, because this has become basically a breaking point for employers and employees. So if we can go to the next one, Barry. So this is another one here where I just sort of setting the context. These are looking at goods going back to 1998 and what their costs are in terms of their increases over time. And you're going to see that the more expensive ones, which are the ones above the zero there, you're going to see the number one most expensive change when it comes to selected consumer goods and services is hospital services. Again, this is probably not a surprise to anyone. That's followed closely by college tuition and fees, which I am feeling the pain of at the moment as well. So those are the two things that have had the largest increases over time. And then you'll see a little bit lower their hourly earnings, housing, food, and beverages. And then there are a number of things, particularly related to technology, that have actually seen a decrease. So when we talk about what's happening in healthcare, well, healthcare keeps going up while a number of other types of consumer goods and services are actually either going down, holding steady, or have more moderate increases. Of course, this is putting pressure on organizations, and I call it paycheck erosion, because essentially what it's doing with these increases is it's taking money out of the pot that can be used for other things within an organization, either reinvesting back into the organization, reinvesting in wages, reinvesting in training and development. It just keeps siphoning off additional funds that we would have. So again, not a pretty picture, but I think as we go through today, we're going to show you some alternative ways of going about healthcare and delivering healthcare that may be able to have an impact on things. Next one, Bear. So this slide here, what I'd ask you to do, if we were all in person, I would ask you to go on your phone or your computer right now and look up the cost of a 50-inch TV, and you guys would be able to tell me in about 7 seconds what the range of prices were. And if I were to ask you to do the same thing for an MRI, my guess is you would struggle greatly, because there are very little there's very little data out there when it comes to the pricing of services. Generally, we only see that when we get our explanation of benefits back after we have a service, right? And so the point here is where there is mystery, there is margin. One thing that we do not have in our healthcare system is pricing transparency. And this is one thing that our firm has been big advocates of, because we really think that we should be knowing what we're paying for. If you were to call up the hospital right now, any hospital, and say, I'd like to get an MRI, can you give me the price? They would be hard pressed to tell you that, which seems a little bit odd, but it's the way the system works. And then we throw in the additional layers of networks and who's in the network, what part of the network are you in, and then it gets to become all very, very convoluted. And therefore, you know, the cost transparency that we're so used to in every aspect of our lives does not exist in healthcare. And if there's if there's mystery when it comes to this stuff, generally there's margin, which means that somebody's profiting off of this, either healthcare insurers or healthcare entities themselves. So what we want to propose is more pricing transparency in the system. And Barry, if you go to the next one, this just gives you an example here. You're going to see an MRI of a lower spine. This is true data, and this is within a particular network. So we're actually showing real pricing here. And so this is a cost differential here that's very, very substantial. As you can see, there's an operation in South Burlington that costs $1,400 less than every other, at least $1,400 less than every other entity that is offering an MRI for a lower spine in a particular region. We bring this up because, you know, from a cost perspective, employees, generally speaking, you know, they don't recognize the cost friction that comes to this. They don't recognize that there's a difference in pricing between different facilities, even in the same network. They just know that they have a certain deductible or a certain copay. And what our charge is, I think, to all of you is to say that, you know, we do have a consumer mindset, for better or for worse, in our country. And one of the things that we can do is, if we have good data, we can make better decisions. So we're going to talk about some strategies with price transparency. And I know there's some national efforts underway to make pricing transparency more apparent to consumers as well. So with that, I'll turn it back to Barry and let him go forward here.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. No, that's great. And I think what Michael's pointing out here is made very clear. I mean, there's a lot of noise around this stuff, right? And that's because everything is so hidden. And it's not just hidden to us, the consumer, or to you, an employer. It's hidden to the government too. And we're at a point now where they're trying to get a handle on this stuff. And what I just put up on the screen here is from an article that was posted a couple months ago in October on CMS.gov. And the CMS is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Essentially, there's a final rule that was put out from CMS, the Department of Labor, and the Department of Treasury that is saying, you know, we're going to make this information available, right? They're going to, what it says here is they're going to give us access to real-time price information, enabling us to know what our healthcare is going to cost before going in for treatment, knowing what it's going to cost in advance. Something we get pretty much with everything else, as Michael pointed out, but not with healthcare. So January 1st, 2023, they're going to require these health insurance carriers to offer an online shopping tool where we, the consumers, can actually see the negotiated rates between the provider and the plan that we have. I realize that this is 2023 and it's 2 years out, but this is headway being made, right? And this first deadline that they have, it's set for the first, they're going to have 500 of the most shoppable items and services, which should be the majority of what most of us consume at the hospital, right? But a year later, which is 3 years from now, they intend on having everything available to us. We always paint this very dismal outlook on healthcare when we talk about this stuff, and for the most part, it is. You look at these numbers, and it can be quite daunting. But this is a light at the end of the tunnel, I think, in some regards. And for me, I wanted to point this out because I think pricing transparency is going to have a positive impact downstream to all of us who are consumers of this stuff. One other piece of legislation that I do want to bring up as well is that there was an executive order earlier this year to loosen restrictions on importation of drugs. Here in America, we actually pay the most for our pharmacy fills. And by loosening these restrictions, we might have the option to start importing our drugs from like Canada or wherever, and which should have some more positive downstream impacts to us as a consumer. So, none of this stuff has come truly to fruition yet, but we're keeping an eye on it because, we have to be able to report what's happening to not just our customers, but we need to know and be able to speak to this stuff. And hopefully we do see this actually come to light soon. I'm excited personally for the online shopping tool because I've been hit with some pretty hefty medical bills in the past, and we call it predatory billing, right, or surprise billing. You really do not know what it costs, and you go in there, and your doctor advises you to do all these different things, and you just say yes because you're the doctor, right? Like, yeah, sure, do whatever you think necessary, and then you get the bill. It's a little backwards in how they approach these things. So we'll talk a little bit about what's going on here in Vermont. The exchange is our Vermont Health Connect. It's the marketplace for individuals and small groups to go get their insurance. In 2020, we started out the year with some really high increases in the exchange. What I'm showing you here are headlines from last year and going into 2021, what the rates are. So heading into 2020, we had double-digit increases approved for both Blue Cross Blue Shield and MVP. Those are the two carriers in Vermont Health Connect that offer the health insurance. 12.4% for Blue Cross and 10% for MVP. Those are massive increases for small employers and individuals to absorb. And we'll get into some data later that kind of talks about what's happening in terms of cost sharing, how employers are addressing this. But because of COVID and all the stuff that's kind of transpired this year, we saw lower rates for 2021. And obviously the carriers are always coming into this thing looking for higher rates. They always come in high, and then they have to go through some approval process with the Department of Financial Regulation and the Green Mountain Care Board. Those two regulators basically tell them what they can do for increases on average for their plans. And we got a little bit of a reprieve this year due to the pandemic, and 4.2% and 2.7% going into 2021, beating trend. And I'll just briefly, I'll probably use the term trend a lot in this presentation, but essentially that's just a term that we use in our industry to describe medical inflation. Medical inflation, or trend as we call it, in Vermont is about 6.5% to 7.5%, depending on what you're using for a source. And it's kind of been in that range for a number of years now. And we like to say if you're beating trend, you're essentially winning, even though you're still coming in above a rate hold, which is what we're always fighting for. Unfortunately, rate decreases aren't really an option these days, but we're beating trend with these increases that were doled out for the exchange. And I just wanted to point that out because that part of that is due to COVID and understanding that all of these things happening to the employers and people, they couldn't take on another double-digit increase. A little bit more about what's going on in Vermont. I mean, there's a lot going on, obviously, but I think the main point I want to kind of hammer on here this year, because of COVID, the utilization, which is what we call like claims utilization, the amount of visits to the hospital, it's down really, really low right now. For this year, we saw, utilization for our clients go down to, 20 or 30% of what it was in 2019. And that's because people were urged to stay home, right? You couldn't go into the doctor unless it was a medical emergency. They basically told us if you had an elective surgery planned or a non-essential procedures, everything had to be postponed. And what we saw was a steep decline in utilization for the medical. As far as pharmacy goes, we didn't really see a decline in utilization. People who need their pharmacy scripts filled still got them filled, whether it was mail order or they went and picked it up at the pharmacy. People were still able to get their pharmacy scripts filled, which is a good thing. And that remained pretty steady. But the main driver of costs is medical. I mean, that's where the bulk of claims come in. There was a lot of communication from the carriers during all this stuff too. And I'm sure as members, you probably saw a lot of it, but as brokers, you got a ton. It was like daily from every carrier. And they did a lot of different things throughout the pandemic, right? They were allowing special enrollment periods for people who didn't have coverage. Usually you need to have a qualifying event to go ahead and get coverage. It has to be open enrollment or you have to get married or something. But they were allowing people to get that coverage without a qualifying event. They were explaining that they would cover COVID testing for patients with no copays or deductible requirements. They were doing a lot of different things, and I think they reacted pretty swiftly. The ancillary benefits that we deal with, and that's like your life and disability insurance. If you had a 1/1 renewal, you really probably didn't benefit from this. But for folks that renew, off cycle from the calendar year, we saw a lot of rate holds, right? They saw everything going on, and in an effort to retain business, we saw a lot of rate holds happening for those types of benefits. And I will actually back up and make one point about the claims utilization. It's low overall, but we did see an uptick in mental health claims. And I do want to point that out because, when I'm reading about this stuff, the analysts keep talking about mental health claims. And I think it's an interesting point because of all this virtual stuff we're doing, they refer to the isolation and remote work. It's causing a lot of anxiety and depression, and we're seeing mental health claims go up. It's not enough to bring that utilization as a whole up, but it's being shifted to that area. And it's also being shifted to EAP. I was talking to, for those of you who have an employee assistance program, EAP providers, they provide utilization reports. And oftentimes, a lot of employees don't use their EAP or even know it's there if it's not promoted. But they're seeing a lot of activity on EAP as well. And I know for my clients, a few of them have actually put in an EAP this year just because they wanted to provide that at-home resource for employees. The other thing I wanted to point out on here was telehealth. This has kind of been considered an add-on service that all the carriers promote every year. Like, oh, you're in Vermont and you've got rural employees, like you should use telehealth. And, and for whatever reason, it never really gained a lot of traction. People aren't really interested in having doctor visits on their mobile phone. But because of COVID, a lot of these carriers started waiving the copay and deductible requirements associated with it, especially during the lockdown. I know Blue Cross did that. And people started using telehealth. And I think, because we're forced to do all of these remote sessions, whether it's a conference or a seminar, team meeting, or Thanksgiving with your family, we're all doing this virtual stuff now. And I think telehealth is it's here to stay, and people are starting to use this stuff. And I personally used it this morning. Actually, we have a on-site health clinic for Hickok and Boardman, and I did a remote session this morning to get a script filled, and it was 10 minutes, but it didn't feel odd because I'm doing this stuff all the time virtually. And then there's actually one more thing on your Medicare Advantage plans, just to kind of give you an update on the market here in regard to that. For those of you with a retiree population on your medical plans, there's some Medicare Advantage options now that are available that weren't available previously. We've had some options with MVP, but Blue Cross has put out a new Blue Advantage product. You've probably seen ads for it on TV. I keep seeing it online when I'm watching the news. But Aetna is also in our marketplace now as well, and they're offering a Medicare Advantage plan. And what we've seen for the couple of clients we've done RFPs for, moving that retiree population into a fully insured Medicare Advantage product has produced significant savings. And that's because as we get older, we tend to utilize more healthcare. So moving that into one of these products might be beneficial for you if you've got that type of population. Michael, I don't know, do you have anything else to add on Vermont market update? Good.
That's good.
Okay. All right, we're gonna jump into the benefits survey results and talk a little bit about that. The first chart that I want to kick off with is funding arrangements, and I think this is a great place to start. And that's because it doesn't matter if you have a high deductible health plan or a traditional copay plan. Every plan has a mechanism underneath it called a funding arrangement, right? You're self-funded or you're fully insured. And we've been tracking this data for a while, and the graph has kind of expanded. It used to just be, a few bars, but now we've added some other products in here to show what people are doing. I want to point out that in 2018, in that yellow box, our fully insured column was at 48%, and now it's at 29%. And as you can see, as you pan right, that self-funded bar has gone up significantly. I didn't put the data down for what that used to be, but it's all moving into that column. And as we look at this thing and these other products, we have level funded at 12%. We've got Blue Edge at 11%, captives at 4%. Those are also self-funded products. But we, for our purposes, want to see where people are going. So we broke it out a little bit more than just self-funded. And when you add all of those up, it's actually 54% now are going self-funded. It's a very high adoption rate for the self-funding, funding arrangement. And, I just think this is very telling. The dominant fully insured area has now moved to self-funded, and there's reasons for that. And there's in a couple slides, we'll get into why that might be happening. But I think this is a great place to start. And at the bottom, you'll also notice it says ICRAs in 2020, not captured in survey. ICRAs were brand new this year in 2020. And when I was putting the slide deck together, I realized that we didn't capture that. And I think next year we'll add that as an option for in here. It's new, and without getting too into it, I will just say quickly what it is. Essentially, an employer can have an HRA where they pay premiums for their employees to go into the exchange. It's a product that's kind of a loophole for large employers who might not be able to get into the exchange because they have more than 100 employees. But it gives them an option if they are in a really tough spot to send their employees into the exchange and perhaps get better plans at better rates. But there's a lot of nuance in that, right? Because now we're putting our employees in on individual plans, and we're no longer doing group insurance. And there's a lot that goes into that. We'll probably do an hour seminar on that next year. But for what it's worth, we'll capture that next year. Any questions on this stuff, by the way? You see anything in the chat, Michael?
No, nothing in the chat. I just want to mention my favorite is the not sure. That's
Yeah, right.
To make sure I'm getting funded.
Yeah, seriously. I hope that's none of my clients, because then I'm not doing my job. All right, next slide. Cost increases for all plans. So this is a cool one because we're looking at average increases for all plans combined. Again, it doesn't matter if you're self-funded or if you're fully insured or high deductible, doesn't matter. We're just taking the average of all of our respondents' increases over the years. You're seeing on the top one, we have 2018, 2019, and 2020 all the way down. And we're right around trend. I was saying trend is between 6.5% and 7.5%, depending on where you look or what source you're using. And the last 2 years have been 6% on average. So we're actually beating trend in 19 and 20 on average. But of course, as you pan right on this slide, you can see that we're still getting some high increases, right? In 2020, the highest was 29%, but it was also as low as 0%, right? We had someone got a rate hold, but the average is 6%, which I think is good. Right now, when I looked at the Siegel Consulting Group, which does a really nice report that gives us a lot of data on different national trends, they have medical trends pegged at 7%. So a national trend is usually right around Vermont trend. It's not too far off. It's usually within a half percentage point. But again, we're beating that. Another note here is high deductible health plans and traditional plans are trending at about the same amount. You can't see them broken out here, but when you look at them individually, they are trending about the same. All right. This is a different way to look at it too. So we spent a lot of time talking about the fully insured versus self-insured. And what I want to show here is that the average increases on the fully insured plans at the top of this page. I don't know if you can see there it is. 8% on average for traditional plans, 10% average increase for high deductible health plans. Those are for the fully insured groups. For those in the self-insured plans, we're getting a 4% for the traditional and 6% for high deductible. There's a 4% swing for both. So people in the self-insured plans are actually doing better. And, I had a conversation with Michael about this, and, this has kind of been happening for a while now. As we've been looking at the data, people are migrating out of the fully insured pool. And what's happening is if you have good claims and you're able to get out of a fully insured product and go self-insured, whether it be level funded or in a captive, you're leaving that pool. And what's happening is it's degrading the fully insured pool that's left. So you're left with a lot of high risk. And the way that impacts you is when your rates are actually developed by the underwriters, they're not just looking at your experience, they're also formulating your rates based on how the rest of the pool is running. And they segregate their pools, right? They've got their level funded pool and their fully insured pool. If all the good risk is coming out and going self-insured, we're left with higher claims in that fully insured pool, and it's adversely affecting the folks that remain there. So, you know, the story here is, you know, we got to do something different. Fully insured has been the way for a very, very long time. And I think this is a call to action to start investigating some other funding options, some alternative options to see if you can do a little better. And, you know, honestly, I'm not going to sit here and say if you go self-funded, you're going to all of a sudden get better renewals, because that's not the case. You can see very quickly if you pan right on these self-insured, they're still getting high renewals here too. I mean, claims are claims. You can't forget that. The highest was 13% for traditional, and a high deductible health plan, someone got a 20%. You can still get rate holds. A lot of it is still dependent on how your plan runs, what your claims are. Do you have high cost claimants? Those things all come into play. But again, your rates are blended between your own experience and how the rest of the pool is running. And oftentimes your own experience is weighted more heavily in a self-insured arrangement. And I hope that makes sense. It's a lot, and we talk about this stuff all the time, and I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, please type a question into the chat box. But yeah, I think self-insured plans, that's kind of where we've been. I always look at this thing too as a kind of like a spectrum. You have fully insured on one end, and you've got your captives on the other, or traditional self-funding on the other end. And in the middle, you've got these little middle step tiers that are technically self-funded, but they protect you from high risk that you would have in traditional self-funding. And those are those level funded products we've referenced a couple of times. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that. This next slide is a graph that didn't come from our survey. This is from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and it's a lot like Michael's slide we showed earlier, because it's showing premium increases compared to regular inflation and workers' earnings. His was a line graph. This is a bar graph. I just wanted to pull this up again because I think it comes into play in just a moment as we talk about employee contributions to premium. Basically, these orange bars are showing you what the health insurance increases are every 5 years, going back to 2000. Looking all the way to the right, 2015 to 2020, we're seeing that premiums went up on average for families about $4,000 or 22%. And that's the 22% you see here. Meanwhile, regular inflation over that 5 years was 10% and workers' earnings were 15. That gap that Michael talked about is here. It's not as large as it was from 2010 to 2015, the 27 to 10%, but we've had this trend going on for a long time. And I think what we're seeing, and we'll notice it in just a moment as we look at data, what's happening is employers are getting these increases and they would like to just continue saying, all right, we pay 80% of premium. But then they look a little bit closer and they say, well, oh man, that's $40 extra a paycheck for my employees. I don't think they can afford that. And what happens is these employers start absorbing more of those premium increases each year. And we'll show you what I mean by that. Employee contributions as a percentage of premium in 2019, we'll just focus on single and family for the sake of this conversation. But singles, on average, pay 20% of premium. Employer pays 80%. Families pay 28% of premium. Now, I look back a couple more years to like 17. Singles have been around 20% for a while now. Families have been between 25 and 30% on average. Look at 2020, they start coming down. We're seeing singles at 17% and families at 22%. And what that is saying to me is that the employers are starting to pick up more of these increases. And what does that do in turn? It doesn't allow them to increase salary. So it's a perpetual cycle where these workers' earnings are staying stifled because employers keep putting more of the bill on the insurance premium. And I was curious, I was looking at that last slide for Kaiser, and I looked for another one to try to prove this point nationally, and it's happening here as well. So this graph that you're looking at is showing the employee portion, the employer, excuse me, this light blue is the employer portion of a average family premium, and the dark blue is the employee portion. The total amount of the premiums at the top, this is 2010. In 2015, this is it, going up again from 13 to 17,000, and we're looking at this stuff climb, right? So what's interesting is I added these yellow boxes, and the employer contribution back in 2010 was 71% of premium. Now in 2020, it's 74%. And if you look at the employee, it's gone down from 29% to 26%. But I also don't want to, make it sound like employers are paying less, because they're not. You can see it in the numbers. We were at about 4,000, and now we're at 5,500 over the last 10 years. So employees have picked up another 1,600 in premium for their families, on average, nationally, over the last 10 years. But you look at the employer side of things, they've actually picked up, what is it, $7,000 in premium, while the employees are picking up 1,600. So I just thought it was interesting to show that this isn't happening just in Vermont, but these insurance premiums are just so insane. Employers are like, well, I can't pass this all on to my employees, and they're starting to change up their approach and how they cost share. And I thought that was very telling. Oh, one other thing I actually wanted to mention on this too, it just occurred to me. I was talking to someone about this graph, and it came up that they were saying for their company for 2021, like right now, they were saying that their employer was going to absorb the entire increase on medical, but they were also going to not give out raises this year. And this person told me that, everyone at their company was thrilled except for the people not on the medical plan, right? Because they're like, hey, okay, this is great, but I'm not on the medical plan. What are you doing for me? I'm not getting a raise. And my natural question was, well, do they offer an opt-out? Maybe there's some opportunity there for, the employees not on the plan to get some sort of financial compensation. The answer was no, which I thought was pretty surprising. So I thought that was a little food for thought. If you are one of these employers who are absorbing these medical increases, you do have employees that aren't taking the medical plan. And I wanted to look at our data to see, I only have one slide on this, but I wanted to see who was offering opt-outs. And we actually saw that 59% of our respondents do offer an opt-out. And down below, you'll actually see what those work out to as dollar amounts. On average, we're looking at about $1,800 or $1,900 for singles and families to opt out. But we do see it as high as $5,000 for a family to opt out on the medical plan. It may seem like a big number, but at the same time, if you think about what you spend annually on their family premiums as an employer, 5,000 is a drop in the bucket in a lot of ways. So just something to think about.
Hey, Barry, we had a question from Michelle at National Life, and she was asking us whether we think opt-outs are worth it. And you want me to try to take that one, or do you want to jump in first?
Go for it.
I think my answer is, Michelle, it depends. I think from a sense of equity, they may be worth it, because Barry's point is a good one. If, certain people are getting a benefit that others aren't, well, is that fair? So you kind of have to work that through to some extent. But I also have a view of, this is a benefit that's offered, and it's up to you whether or not you choose to participate in it. And if you don't, then unfortunately you don't get any sort of monetary compensation because of that. So I really think it depends on the organization, your culture, how you want to go about it, the sense of equity within the firm that you're working at, whether or not opt-outs are worth it. Now, they're still relatively common. I will say that the numbers that we're seeing here, we haven't seen them change, even though the increase in premiums, the opt-out amounts that people are getting are about the same. So it's not as if the opt-outs are trending at 6 or 8% every year. And it comes down to whether or not organizations feel like they need to do so. And the only other comment I'd make that Barry mentioned about employee contributions, one of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of organizations are sort of slanting towards the single premium rather than the two-person or family, where they're lowering premiums for the single, because it's like, well, I'm hiring you, I'm not.
You cut out for a second. You muted, Michael. There you go.
So excited, I muted myself. A lot of organizations are going in that direction as well. So I think the way we look at it is there's one big bucket of money. How are we going to split this thing up between employee contributions, opt-outs, plan design, et cetera? And there's no one formula that works. It really depends on the situation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what are the options for Vermont employers? We're talking about all these different things, funding arrangements, plan types, and so forth. And this is a slide that many of you have probably seen because Michael has used it in the past. Number one is DNA, which he's coined as the do nothing approach, right? Includes crossing your fingers. You kind of just have your open enrollment every year and then just, hope for the best. Status quo, right? We're not doing much, just kind of going through the motions. The number 2 on your self-funding active plan management, kind of the opposite of that, right? It's not the open enrollment and forget about it. You have to start thinking about managing the plan, whether it's reference-based pricing, direct contracting, pricing transparency tools, as we've talked about, pharmacy formularies, on-site clinics. There's a whole myriad of things that can be considered when we talk about active plan management. Number 3 is defined contribution, which is kind of like active plan management. I know we consider that like a plan strategy, but essentially that is, utilized often in the exchange. We have a lot of groups under 100 employees that go, here's a defined amount of cash, here's $500, you're saying, well, go pick the plan you want, right? It's giving options. And it's really helpful, and Michael can attest to this as well, when you have these multi-generational workforces. Healthcare needs are very unique to the individual. So we're finding more and more that folks are going this route because, some people are okay with a high deductible and want more money in their paycheck, whereas some want, the Cadillac of plans and will pay up for it. And this is from a budget perspective, a company can they know exactly what's going out the door because it's defined, and then you're giving choice to your employees. And it's really easy in the exchange because the plans are there and so forth, whereas in the large group market, we've got to create and curate these plans that we want to offer our folks. And then ICRAs are very similar to the exchange in the sense that, we're offering, if you send someone into the individual market with an ICRA, it's a defined contribution. The employer is saying, here's a bucket of money, go pick what you want, and this is what you have for the whole year. So they're very similar in that. And then the 4th one on here is just stop offering health insurance. And I think on the surface, it might sound enticing to some. You can get out of the whole compliance thing, and suddenly you have this whole bucket of money that you didn't have before that you can reinvest in the company or, allocate to salary, increases, whatever it might be. But unfortunately, the reality there is that that's not really the case. Many of you have union contracts, and there's tax implications. There's massive penalties involved in not offering insurance to all your employees and making it affordable for employees. So it's really not an option. So that's why we've highlighted 2 and 3 in red text for this one, because that's where we want to focus, right? And when you boil all this stuff down, it's, no one's happy with healthcare, but the idea is you got to keep strategizing, right? You got to keep moving forward. And, a lot of you probably know who this guy is. This is Bill Belichick. He's the head coach of the New England Patriots, and he's not known for being a real personable, happy dude, but he is known for being a game time adjustment guy, right? Doesn't matter if he's winning by 100 or he's losing. You can always see him on the sidelines taking notes and changing up his strategy. And I think we're all in this healthcare game, right? And unless you plan on exercising option 4 and just getting out of the game, we got to keep brainstorming. And the next few slides have to do with medical plan strategies that some folks have already implemented and that some are considering implementing. And there's no one better to talk about that stuff than our man, Michael Kilfoyle. You're muted again. Mute. There it is.
Yeah, I was calling myself a master adjuster. So I guess to start off this section, I want to be sensitive to time here too, because we do want to leave time for questions at the end. Is as we start this out, when we start thinking about strategy, I think largely a number of us have always ceded our strategy for the most part to the carriers and the healthcare providers. And I think what we're seeing now in the marketplace is that organizations are trying to take back some of that strategy and take back some of that control. And the data is proving that out. As you'll see here on this slide, this talks about on-site and near-site. And you're going to see in 2019, 7% of participants said they implemented one, where we jumped to 2020, and that's up to 12%. And I think even more importantly is that many more are considering. And I know a number of folks on the call today are now a part of a clinic, whether it's Michelle at National Life, where they operate their own clinic, or recently a number of organizations, including ours at Hickok and Boardman, joined to put together clinic in South Burlington. So it's a shared clinic, if you will. And I think one of the advantages of this, and probably Michelle and others can speak even better than I can about this, is that we're now allowing primary care to be delivered in a setting that is a lot more receptive, a lot more time is spent, and there's more involved with health coaching and opportunities for people to feel better and really track their health in a very nurturing, welcoming environment. And the overall focus is on well-being. And the data has proven this out, that when you put in strategies like this, which is, by the way, it's a hefty cost up front. So I don't want to make light of the fact you just go ahead and do this. There's a lot of thought that has to go into it, but the ROI has been proven, as opposed to some other initiatives when it comes to wellness, where maybe there isn't really a true ROI, if you will. This is one that has. So this is one strategy where it's sort of taking control back, and we're having a set fee now where we're allowing our employees to go in. And this could probably be a seminar all on its own, but it's something that's definitely happening in our marketplace, and more employers are thinking about joining something like this. So this would be one thing to consider if you haven't already. Next one, Barry.
Yep. And I think it's interesting too, you look back a couple of years here, and I mean, these numbers are non-existent. And now you look at the considering 9% and 19 is up to 22%. People are having this conversation. And I just think if we keep talking about this stuff, and you understand that you can band together with like-minded employers to make it happen, it does bring down those costs. You don't have to do it on your own, which I think is important too.
And the next is, we talked about the consumer pricing tools. There are tools out there available right now. One of them is Healthcare Blue Book, for example, where you can go price shopping, if you will, within a certain radius, and you could get a green, yellow, or red marker depending on the cost of the provider, whether it's a good price, a fair price, or like, don't, I just dropped the presentation there. There we are. or whether it's a really high price. So, and then you combine these with incentives. So that's another tool where we're trying to put the power into employees' hands to make good decisions. Now, one of the problems in our marketplace, unfortunately, is we have basically a monopolized market to some extent when it comes to healthcare, because we have some dominant players in the market. That does not mean there are not opportunities, though. And so as we keep pushing these consumer pricing tools out, I think we're going to see more movement in this regard, more transparency, and more consumer-based type of approaches. And then there's the claims analytics software. And this is all sort of combined. Barry talked about the funding mechanism. Then we talked about on-site clinics. Part of this is it's a total strategy where you try to find the right funding, and then you find the right tools, and you find the right healthcare delivery system, and then you really want to get into the data. So now we really are trying to get into the data where we're saying, okay, let's really look at what's happening here, not individualized, by the way, this is in aggregate, so that we can come up with a strategy so that if we see that we have a lot of people getting knee replacements, well, maybe what we do is we direct contract with a provider that does a really good job in both quality and price with our knee replacements, that type of thing. So, but without data, you can't have that. So more data is coming here. And the message, as you probably figured out, is this is not getting easier, it's getting more difficult. But to affect real change, this is what employers, we would argue, have to do with somebody's help to make sure that they're doing it properly. Next one, Barry. And then, as Barry mentioned, we're seeing more and more employers looking at doing some of the defined contribution strategies. And this really is something that is old. For those of us who have been around a while, you remember the cafeteria plans. It's very similar to a cafeteria plan. It's just sort of like retool so that we're trying to come up with a better way of doing it and using technology to do so. But I think that the more important point of this now is that we've got 5 generations in the workplace right now. And the question is, are benefits meeting the needs of all these different generations? Because the needs of my daughters, who are 19 and 21, are much different than perhaps mine or my mother's. So who are all in the workplace. So what does this mean from a way we go about our benefits? How are we making our decisions? And sometimes it could be we offer multiple plans in a defined contribution environment. So that would be up to each organization. I know Michelle just had a question there, so I'm just going to pop that up. What do you do for employees? Yeah, employers with employees in multiple states. Another good question there, Michelle, because particularly in healthcare, it's a localized market. And so what you have to do is you have to really understand that particular market and see what you can do there. Now, some of these like pricing transparency tools, they're available nationwide. So that's really, I won't say it's easy to implement, but it's easier to implement. But when we talk about other aspects, so maybe in Dallas, there are a number of different healthcare providers and they compete with one another. So it's a much different market than it is in Vermont. Well, maybe what we could do is we could actually directly contract with one of the healthcare providers to get a better price, because we would then shuffle people to that particular provider with maybe a lower copay or a lower cost compared to the other ones. So again, it's really a strategy where you have to look at your individual markets that you're in and try to figure that out. I know it's a quick sort of broad brush answer, but given what we were talking about today, hopefully that.
With an ICRA that we implemented this year, we had some employees in other states, one being like North Carolina, and it kind of fell on us to look at their marketplace and figure out what that exchange looked like. And it was much different than ours. I mean, the premiums were based, they were age banded. It depended how old you were to get an appropriate price quote. So we actually had to dive in and start looking at it. So it is very unique to each state. But if you have, the resources or you're working with an advisor, I mean, there are ways to look into this stuff, but you don't want to jump into any of these without that proper educational piece. And it's a great question. And I think that's the last one, Michael.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I just did want to mention too is that some of you, we know a lot of you on the call today, so some of you are further along the continuum than others, and that's just fine. I call it the fed up continuum, quite frankly. It's like, how far along that fed up continuum are you that you really want to start doing different things? Because obviously we do need to do things differently. It's not working. We're seeing this. And rather than just sort of nibbling at the edges by doing little things and unfortunately not having a huge impact, I think it's basically a paradigm shift in how we have to approach this if you really truly want to have an effect.
Yeah, and there's no surprises on this slide, really. I mean, these are strategies that would essentially degrade the plan or not offer a plan at all. And the numbers indicate that people aren't considering these options, which are providing a narrower network or dropping health insurance completely. Next segment, plan type. So again, we'll try to pay attention to time here, but what we did was we broke this down to two different categories. The first being large group. Large group for this is defined as groups with more than 50 employees that are full-time. And that is, how they define an applicable large employer under ACA. What we were doing was trying to figure out what are people enrolled in, and 48% are high deductible health plans. And that's been kind of the trend over the last few years. And these are for folks that are not in Vermont Health Connect. And for these people that are offering these high deductible health plans, you're dealing with high out-of-pocket costs for your employees. And what we find is in most cases, they're combined with some sort of tax advantage account like an HRA or HSA. We broke it down also by the Vermont Health Connect population. And for this, it's less than 100, because in Vermont, if you're under 100 employees, you can enter Vermont Health Connect. And what you're seeing here is, the vast majority of folks are using the platinum, gold, and silver plans here at the top. And those are traditional copay plans with low deductibles. Out-of-pocket maximums vary. But we're also seeing high numbers in the HCHPs for both gold and silver, both at 12%, which are in line with those top three. I will caveat, though, we see this high 21% for platinum. Everyone's offering this platinum plan. Oftentimes, that's in conjunction with another plan. I would say almost always, at least in the cases that I've seen. Again, it goes back to offering multiple plans and defined contributions and all sorts of different things. But I just want to point out that most of the plans on here are always offered in conjunction with another, because all these plans have positives and negatives, and mostly negatives. But I just think, again, it's trying to meet the needs of your employees, and we're seeing that here. It's pretty spread out in terms of what people offer. But to focus on the high deductible health plan piece and these tax advantage accounts, we want to show you a couple of data sets. When we polled our participants, we found that 27% of employers were offering an HSA, and 36% were offering HRAs, 37% were offering either. Now, as most of you probably know, the HSA is employee funds and the employer funds are the HRA. The HRA is a little bit more popular because it's employer funds. At least that's what we think the data suggests, and because we talk with employers all the time. It's a great cost containment tool for employers, right? Because they know that they can put money aside as a benefit to their employees, and understanding very well that it's very unlikely all that money is going to get spent, which gets rolled into the next year. Whereas in an HSA, if you're giving money into an HSA or funding an HSA, that money now belongs to the employee, they leave, it's theirs, and so forth. So we do find that HRAs are a little more popular. And I'll also note that in rare instances, some groups will offer both. And I don't see it often. I think I have one group that offers them in conjunction with one another. It's an HSA with a post-deductible HRA. And there's a few ways you can structure it, but there's a lot of nuance in that. And I think there's reasons why people don't do it, and we need to get into the weeds on it. But I think next year we'll also add a question figuring out how many folks are actually offering them together. So just to follow up on the HSA HRA funding piece, what we're seeing here in the top box is what percentage of the deductibles funded into an HSA. And this is for people that fund HSAs. Mind you, there are lots of employers that offer an HSA, a health savings account, and don't fund it at all. All the money in there is contributed by the employee from the employee's paycheck. But for the employers that actually do put money into their employee's HSA, we found that on average, you're putting about 50% of the deductible inside of that HSA for them. If the average deductible is about $3,000, that means they're putting in about $1,500 into that HSA every year for their employees. That may make sense for a group that might have, low turnover. It's a great benefit to give your employees that money to help for unexpected expenses. But if you're a company that has a lot of maybe entry-level workers with lots of turnover, that's money out the door that you'll never see again. And I think that's why if you look below for the HRA, you see people, adding a little bit more in there. And that's why we saw in the previous slide why more people are offering the HRA, because there's not as much risk involved in that. On paper, you're offering this great benefit, but it's a cost containment tool for the employer. And you'll see that they're oftentimes more generous with the funding amount. As a percentage of deductible, 66% for a single, 61% for a family. So anywhere from 10 to 15% more than what's funded into an HSA. Any questions on HSA, HRA? Okay. So we added a new segment to the survey this year on remote work. That's because obviously that's what everyone is doing. We were just curious of what people had to say about it. And when we asked how many organizations had employees working remotely, we had 90% respond yes. So that is telling. What was interesting to me was this slide, because I would have expected the numbers to be a little bit higher. So what has been the cost to set up an individual employee to work remotely? 73% responded $0 to $250. Now I was thinking when I read the question that this thing would be closer to 500 or 1,000, but this is telling me that maybe the respondents either already had provided computers or technology to their employees, work phones, whatever it might be, or they allowed their employees to use their own personal equipment to log in remotely. Because I don't think you can get someone a computer and set up for $250. But I thought this was an interesting graph. 51 respondents, and it was pretty low upstart cost to get those employees going. The main concerns from an employer perspective, we asked them to rank them in order. Performance was the biggest concern, as well as quality of work, and those kind of go hand in hand with one another. Supervisor performance, work-life balance came in fourth. Engagement fifth, and so forth. I think I removed another slide that was actually about what employee concerns were. And interestingly, the fourth one on this slide was number one. It was work-life balance. So I just thought that was interesting. From an employer perspective, we obviously care about the performance and quality of work because we're running a business. But the employees had expressed that it was the work-life balance at number one. And then I think it was connection and collaboration was number two for them. Now, keeping performance and quality of work in mind, I want to show this slide. Of the employees currently working remotely due to COVID-19, what percentage will continue to be allowed to work remotely? We do see a lot of folks saying 0 to 25%. 32% said that. And we don't know if that's 0%, like no workers are going to be able to work remote, or 25% will be allowed to work remote. But I do want to show that, 68% of people said, yes, we're going to allow our folks to continue working remotely, which to me indicates that their concerns on the prior slide were kind of a non-issue, right? Productivity probably didn't decline as much as they had thought. Quality of work probably did not decline as much as they had thought, because they're now considering letting them stay remote post-pandemic. And I know we've been remote for a long time now, and I'm not sure we'll ever be back in the office. But, from what I've heard talking to Michael and some of the others in management, they haven't seen a decline or heard anything from client. I think we've been able to continue to do our work effectively remote. And, that I think that was a concern for them as it was everyone else. Paid time off.
So I jump back in on this, right? And I guess my comment on the remote work is, I think that, the three of us here at Hickok and Boardman kind of showing that, because as many of you know, I live in New Hampshire and have for, 30 years. Barry's in Vermont, and then Stacy moved to Colorado 4 years ago now, Stacy, 3 years ago? 3 years ago. So we've been sort of in practice of being remote. We try to think of ourselves as a leading workplace and doing some of the things that we are seeing some of the trends. And it has worked out pretty well. And I know in talking to a number of you that, you're probably not going to go back fully to, in-person arrangements. So let's jump into paid time off, because this is another trend we're seeing here. And some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but I think the days of, 1 week after a year, and 2 weeks after 2, and 5 weeks after 28, or whatever it happens to be, I think those are starting to go away, because I think particularly with the newer generations coming into the workplace, they value PTO or CTO much more than prior generations. So we're sort of seeing a shift away from those types of arrangements. They still exist, obviously, but more and more employers are rethinking about how they go. And I think what we're also seeing is a trend towards more of a combined time off, rather than, a sick bank here and a vacation bank here, personal days here. So what I think we would offer up to all of you is, if you haven't looked at your vacation or your paid time off policies in a while, it might be a good time to do so, because as you're recruiting out there and trying to find talent, which we know is hard to find, this could be a differentiator as you go forward. So think about it from that perspective. So next one, Barry. And next is compensation. And as you guys know, we have a small compensation practice within our firm. So we're trying to, see what's happening in the marketplace here. And what we're really seeing hasn't changed much. We just asked some basic questions like, what are the salary increases? And these averages of 3%, this is held true since we started asking this question, I want to say back in like 14, 15. So that's basically stayed the same. But I think it's a function of our times, if you will. We have a tight labor market here. And I think the more interesting questions would be, what are you paying for certain positions? Because that would really dictate things. And then one thing I would mention too is that make sure that you guys are looking at your pay from a market-based perspective, just not from your own perspective, because oftentimes there'll be a misalignment between what you may be paying someone and what their actual worth is out in the marketplace. And I remember hearing Frank Sadowski, who many of you know, he was telling a story about a fellow he was an IT administrator, one of the network folks, and started, I want to say, at like $50K, and had been with the organization for 3 years. And he was doing a fantastic job. So they were bumping him up 6 or 7% every year. So, he was somewhere in the $65,000 range. Well, it turns out that from a market-based perspective, someone with 3 years as an IT administrator was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 or 90,000. So even though they thought they were doing great by, giving this person pay raises, it actually wasn't keeping up with the market. So the point being here is that here are the big fat averages and what we're seeing from salary increases. But more importantly, I think, is to look at it from a market-based perspective, just to make sure that your salaries are sort of lining up. Not something you have to do every year, but we'd recommend every couple, 3 years to do something like that. Next, Barry. Oh, here's the boring stuff, right? Okay, so, we didn't give you a bunch of data here, but did want to talk about some of the ancillary benefits that you're offering. So when it comes to dental, vision, group life and disability, and then even 401k, I don't want to say 401k is boring because it's important to people, but all of these markets are essentially, they are mature, if you will. The benefits are mature, the markets are mature. What you're generally seeing are low cost increases. So, not to say that you don't want to pay attention to them, but I don't think that whether you're covering orthodontia at 50% is going to make or break whether you get that superstar on your team. So I think you want to stay competitive with these benefits and keep them, but don't overdo it. I think better time spent is on the medical where, there is work to be done and there's some opportunity there as well. On the group life and disability side, I would say that if you haven't shopped that out in a while, that's a very, very competitive market, much more so than the medical market. We're only going to have 3 carriers in Vermont from a fully insured perspective. There are a number out there. So you should look at this because you can probably do a little bit better if that's something of interest. And then I've got the voluntary benefits highlighted there only because this is getting back to trying to meet the needs of different generations where somebody who's a snowboarder who's 25 might want accident insurance because the likelihood that they'll break a leg snowboarding is greater. So it's the whole point about making more benefits available, oftentimes at no cost to employers. It's something to consider as an overall benefit strategy. And then you can see there with the 401k, no significant changes. We have seen employers restoring the match. That was a real concern for a while there. Or Michelle, right? More likely someone who is a snowboarder and is 55, right? So 401k, we're not seeing any major changes there and restored matches, which is good. So I think there's some opportunities here, and I would really look at the voluntary benefit piece to sort of round out your benefit strategy because you can plug some holes there and meet some needs of perhaps employees within your organization that maybe weren't met before. So stuff to consider. This would be done on an annual basis. This is not something you should be looking at like on a monthly basis, but to try to make sure that you're keeping up with trends and you're implementing strategies that will work for your overall benefit strategy.
Yeah, and I'll just add on the 401k piece, we do survey on retirement solutions every couple of years. And this year we did collect data on 401ks and 403bs and all of that good stuff. But because of time constraints, we aren't going to get into that. We do have a retirement solutions division of our firm, and they are doing a seminar, I think, second quarter of next year, where they'll probably draw on a lot of the survey results for that segment. So tune into that if you're interested. All right, so the last section we're going to cover here is on wellness. And as you all know, this is an old conversation. Been going on for a very long time about, how do we measure ROI on this stuff? Everyone's wondering, like, how do we make it work with staffing and resources? And honestly, the questions are still the same, right? It comes down to resources and money and time and who's going to actually do it and implement these programs. And quite frankly, there still is no way to truly measure ROI on these things. But we can say that culturally, there is a positive impact of wellness. We do see the organizations that are doing it, they like the program, and every year it gets better. And the carriers, at least in a large group marketplace, do receive funds in a lot of instances from the carriers, whether it be Cigna or Blue Cross. They're getting funds to help them with these programs, and oftentimes they get a designated person from the carrier to help them kind of navigate, their monthly newsletters or whatever it might be. So we'll show you a few exhibits that we have here. When we polled our participants, we found that 43% said yes, they do offer a wellness program, and 44% said no. It's almost split right down the middle, with 13% not having, considering but not having implemented. Who's primarily responsible for overseeing your wellness program? This has been the case for a long time. It falls onto HR oftentimes, people in the benefits group. And, as we know, as HR professionals, there's a lot already on your plate, and compliance being a big piece of that. And I think that's been a big hesitation with a lot of groups in implementing these things, or why wellness programs haven't grown, because it falls on one or two people to run the thing, right? Amongst all the other things we have to do. 43% have an internal wellness committee of the respondents that were polled. And, you know, the groups that have the most success tend to have one of these committees in place, right? Because you can spread out the work. You have representation from different areas within your organization, which helps give you kind of a better view of the people and what's going on. So just some food for thought there. Some programs that people are doing, or some elements within the programs that people are implementing. We only pulled a few of these, the ones that had more than 50% implemented, but we'll just run through these quickly. You got health club reimbursements, 52%, employee assistance programs. We talked about this. A lot of folks have these in place right now. I know I had a bunch of clients put them in during the pandemic. They're relatively cheap. And if you go with a third party, they tend to be a little more robust than the ones that come with your maybe long-term disability insurance. Very popular. On-site educational seminars. Those should probably be online educational seminars now, but 65% have done those, considering 12%. On-site flu shots, a lot of folks are doing that, 80%. On-site near-site health clinics, we spent a lot of time on this. That number, 17%, to me is just crazy. It's been growing the last few years. It was almost non-existent, 4 or 5 years ago. Telemedicine is becoming the new norm, right? Everyone's doing everything virtually. So those are some common program elements. We have all of these in the survey, which is a 150-page document. So if you are interested in, purchasing a survey, or if you actually participated, you will get the survey sent to you. You'll have access to all the data on these elements as well. But just to name a couple: online health assessments, biometric screenings, health fairs. People are doing these things, but the problem is getting buy-in from people, right? You got to have your culture buy into this stuff. And participation is oftentimes the hard part, getting people to actually fill out the health assessment. So the last exhibit I want to show on this is how people have been incentivizing people to participate. And this is on financial incentives. There are 101 respondents here, which is probably the most I've seen on any of the exhibits. But that basically works out to 1 percentage point per respondent. So 24%, that's 24 organizations have done cash payments. As a financial incentive. We've seen 7%, 7 organizations contribute extra dollars to someone's HSA or to the HRA. It's like if you do this biometric screening or do this online health assessment, we'll give you an extra $50 or $20, whatever it might be. They're offering it there as well. Some people are offering days off to get them to participate in these programs. Raffles and prizes were very popular, 32%. Public recognition, maybe that goes out in the newsletter. And then people, obviously some do not offer any incentive at all. So before I get into, I think I have one more slide for Michael and then one for me, but I'm gonna have him close out on a little bit about the generations in the workplace piece and who's making decisions on this stuff.
We also did have something come in through the chat, Michael, for you.
Oh.
Remember to unmute myself. Yeah, I saw that Sarah was asking a question. How many employees is that 4% represent? I have to go back and look, Sarah, to see what that number is, but I can tell you that based on what we know in our marketplace. So Sarah's asking about captive arrangements, and captives are essentially when employers band together to form a self-insured pool on their own. And the idea is that you can basically mitigate risk by banding together and have more control over what the risk is. So when you do that, it's really helpful. And I will tell you that it's a huge trend. And I know, Sarah, that we have 3 new clients just this fall going into captive arrangements. I want to say there's about 15 in total in Vermont, and these are health benefit captives. Probably a lot of you know that Vermont is a captive state, right? We have a lot of different captives here. Interesting though, the health benefit captives are domiciled in other places. The ones we're most familiar with are in Ohio and Tennessee, and then the Grand Cayman one, which unfortunately we have not placed any business in yet, so we can go to the Grand Caymans. But so anyway, then Michelle's asking, what's the best size group to consider joining a captive? It's another good question, and generally speaking, we would say 75 to about 1,000 or so. If you're above 1,000, oftentimes employers will set up their own captive arrangements, which is sort of interesting as well, because there are some tax benefits to doing so. So there's no hard and fast rule there, but I think what the captive arrangements have done, particularly for smaller employers who, as Barry mentioned earlier, have been traditionally fully insured, it gives them the option to move into self-insured arrangements without the overall risk that comes along with being self-insured on your own, because we know probably many of you were self-insured in the past perhaps and had an awful experience because of bad claims, and then you felt like you're on an island. Well, at least this island's a lot bigger with a lot of other people who are sharing risks together. So that's that. So Barry asked me to speak to this last slide here before we get close to closing out. And this goes back to the whole idea of the generations in the workplace. And we do have 5 different generations in the workplace right now. And I guess my question to everybody is, when we think about benefits, who's making these decisions on benefit offerings? Typically what we see in organizations, it's the baby boomers and Gen X. And not that we're consciously self-interested, but oftentimes we're not tuned into the needs of other generations because it's our own life experiences. So when we think about Generation Y and Generation Z and what they might want for benefits, which may be different from what we want, are we making sure that we're touching upon those needs? Because as we all know, I mean, what are benefits for? Well, it's for protection for people, of course, but it's really also a recruiting and retention tool. And are we doing all that we can to make sure that our offerings are meeting needs of these different generations so that we can accomplish those goals? So when you start thinking about healthcare and comp and the way you go about flexible arrangements and remote work and PTO and retirement, are you sort of taking into consideration all these generations? Because it's not as if we're going to have less generations in the workplace, and we want to make sure that we're meeting the needs, because I do a lot of speaking on generational differences, and there are differences. Now, people are people, but context is very different. And I think particularly for millennials and Gen Z, their context is much different, and the way they work is much different than us old folks who are 55 and snowboarding still and getting hurt. So what you want to do is really start thinking about how we go about meeting the needs of all these different generations from a benefit standpoint.
Thank you for that. So this is the last slide I have on here, and the reason I put this in was because I remember sitting through this presentation 4 years ago now when Michael had done it. And I was new to Hickok Boardman. I was like, wow, this is great. Kind of a data geek. I really like seeing all this stuff, and it was just helping me kind of figure out what was going on around here being new to Vermont. But I also walked away from that presentation saying, like, okay, now what? Like, what do we do with it? And, I kind of have this guide, like this little bit of a guide of what I've done with some of my clients. And I just think it's helpful to kind of put it in perspective. And I think to make this data work well for you and your organization, you've got to start with number one, which is you got to develop this philosophy around how you want to handle benefits for your organization. Who are you as an organization? Who do you want to be? Who do you want to be, or what do you want to be known for, I should say, as an organization? Who are your employees? Like Michael was saying, who are you trying to attract as new employees? Is it X, Y, or Z generation? Like, who are you trying to attract, and what are you doing now, right? And what do you want to be, and defining that. And then you take the data and you actually benchmark your benefits to it. You can go back a number of years and see where you kind of focused your attention, where you've improved, where you haven't. And at that point, it's a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities conversation, right? At that, when you start looking at the bell curve, you can really figure out, are you middle of the road on your benefits and paying a lot more than your competitors, or you have a great 401k match, and then all of a sudden your deductibles and premiums for health insurance are super high, and you're kind of on the back of the bell curve. How's your PTO policy, right? HSA, HRA funding. There's all these different elements, and honestly, you can't be great at everything, and I think that's the part people might get hung up on, the philosophy piece. We want to give everything to our employees. We want it to be affordable. We want it to be the best. But realistically, we do have budgets. We have constraints, and we really have to try to hone in on what's most important to us. And I think making a plan and sticking to that plan is part of the job of us as advisors to work with you on that. But the benefits philosophy is kind of that guideline that we refer back to every renewal season to see where we've hit and where we haven't touched and where we want to touch. And it's kind of it's just a structure in which we want to operate within. And you got to get buy-in from the top, right? I mean, this is a conversation that happens with management, that everyone's on the same page on what you want to focus on. So, yeah, I just think that the biggest point here is you're not going to be the best at everything, but what's important to you and who are your people that are working for you? Do they care most about pay, or do they want the richest medical benefits, you know, or is it the paid time off, or is it remote work? Figure out where you want to be and use this data to benchmark and then track your progress, because it's not going to happen overnight. It's all about incremental change. So I hope that's helpful. That's all I got. I've got information up here for Michael and I. You know, this survey, I can make some data available, some of these slides, if people want to see some of these slides. If you want the full survey, you're going to get it soon. Stacy, when is that email going out for those who participated? I think she left us. I think it's going out in the next few days, but you guys will have that soon. I know most of you did participate, and thank you for doing that. But before we wrap up, does anyone have any final thoughts, questions, comments? All right. Thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate you tuning in, and take care. Be safe.
Thanks, everyone.